what happens in these things, and many times they involve us in spiritual matters that escape our knowledge. This cousin had connections with prestigious shopping centers, as he, along with his partners, was a great accountant, and had good relationships with the businessmen he advised. And once, a year or two later, wanting to help me, he asked me to show him the book Clinica. And he immediately promised to speak with his clients, owners of large shopping centers in Mexico City. He did, but the product wasn't commercial, and my book was rejected. He didn't understand how that was possible. But the fact is, no one could help me sell my book. This cousin was also the one who lent me the old version of ISIS Unveiled. A book, 2 large volumes, that was a treasure to him. But I doubt he ever read it completely. And Americo Living Trail 237. It was his father, my uncle, who had since passed away, who encouraged me, in my youth, to read the first book by Lobsang Rampa, which he had in his library. Anyway, back to my story. After greeting my aunt and cousins, I asked them if they knew where my children were, as I didn't know if my mother still had them. They were truly astonished by my appearance, and stared at me as if I were a stranger from a distant land. Evidently my mother had gone to great lengths to keep up appearances regarding my mysterious disappearance. When they had recovered from their confusion, they informed me that, as always, the children were at home with my parents. I then asked if I could make a phone call to my mother's house. She calmly replied that she admired her at this crucial moment in my life, and said she would come for me. The trip she had to cover from Netzahualcoyotl to the workers' colony was at least 50 minutes, and she would make it in less than half an hour. I don't think I looked very good because my cousin, who is a few years older than me, got nervous because she was very perceptive, and I think she had the idea that I had gone crazy or something like that, because her current partner's son suffered from mental retardation, and that made her associate him with me, perhaps because of the expression on my face. Trying to act as normal as possible, I asked my aunt to allow me to bathe, and smiling, but at the same time worried, she agreed. I entered the bathroom, and as I undressed, I couldn't completely control my mind, so a formidable evil force attempted, in a direct manner, to wrest control of my physical vehicle from me. But I fought, certain that only the light was within me, and that I had prepared myself to enjoy this marvelous control that God had entrusted to me. For a split second, this undesirable entity took control of me, trying its best to intimidate me, laughing through my mouth in a creepy way. But I immediately said, "You shall not pass, because only the light is in me." I immediately became myself again. And this was the only moment in my experience that an undesirable force briefly controlled me. Throughout this adaptation to my new state of consciousness, I never lost control of my own waking life. I would only do so months later, when I was physically attacked by the director of the Avenue Phoenix Center, my former student. I left the bathroom, and my relatives immediately took me into one of their bedrooms, so I could rest, while they waited for my family. But that wasn't possible, my heart was hurting more. So, as soon as they weren't looking, I went outside, because I needed to get some fresh air. While my relatives were getting worried, when they saw me leaving their house, several of my brothers, my brother-in-law, and my mother appeared in a flash. While I struggled with anxiety about walking and getting some fresh air, to feel a little better, my cousin insisted that I rest and sleep. My brothers hugged me joyfully after at least 3 years without seeing some of them. But I had that ache in my heart, and I started walking the streets, trying to control myself. I was near the Chabacano metro station, and ordered my younger brother to press my heart, while I leaned against a wall, as the ache grew. He did so without asking any details. Suddenly, my mother said, "Americo Living Trail 238. Come on, let's walk to the place where we lived when you were born." Indeed, although I was born in Netzahualcoyotl, my parents' house wasn't located there, but in the working-class neighborhood. So, letting myself go, since I didn't have the strength to go any further, we walked about 6 blocks, and arrived at the door of the place where I had lived since birth. It was an interesting symbol. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law caught up with us in a vehicle at the other end of the street. He told me to lie down inside, while he extended the back seat. I obeyed. My sister and brother-in-law, who were both doctors, began to argue and came to the conclusion that this heart condition was common among the insane people they had visited and observed in mental hospitals, and that was why they placed bandages around their hearts to alleviate the pain. According to my brother-in-law's diagnosis, I was irrevocably in that state, and there was no hope for me. But my sister, fortunately for me, behaved in an outstanding manner and said, "I don't accept it." She recalled that sometimes, when these cases occurred, there was a way to remove the dirt that was in the heart, and that was by sucking on the chest with her mouth, right over the heart. She called it suction. I uncovered my chest, and she began to suck. After a minute of sucking hard, and with great faith, she quickly got out of the car, as if she were half asphyxiated, and headed for the nearest drain, spitting out foul-smelling blood or bloody liquid. How come there was foul-smelling blood in her mouth, if I didn't have any wound on my chest? While he was recovering, he ordered my mother to take her place, and then anyone who wanted to help. My mother took her place, and soon got out of the car to spit. Then my brother tried, but his reaction was milder. After this I found a little rest. I don't know exactly what they did to me, but it helped, although not completely. Much of what could have healed me lay within myself, but the help they were giving me was obviously very important. I arrived at Netzahualcoyotl's house, and saw the children, who were happy to have me back with them. My father hugged me, and began to cry. I, for my part, was exhausted and couldn't sleep very well. They pampered me like a king for that entire week, and they didn't ask me why, what, or how I'd been through. Everyone simply treated me the way families should treat each other every day of our lives. There was a state that I could no longer lose, and that was the profound love for life, like when we are reborn, after having been in danger of death. As for my partner herself, when I left my retreat and later spoke to her on the phone from my home, she was surprised. Americo Living Trail 239. I couldn't judge her, perhaps because I've learned that a cosmic woman never makes mistakes, even if she appears to make them. Because when a human is enveloped in divine grace, they cannot fail. Besides, I myself was the one who had shown her that we cannot advance on our path unless we first manage to live everything as humans. And that was precisely what she decided. She and I would convince ourselves that, if we persisted in being close to each other, even when our paths were already diverging, all we would do was complicate things. Because being together, our mutual attraction became irresistible, given that the masters themselves had fine-tuned us physically, emotionally, and mentally. Therefore, we needed distance to control our irresistible sexual attraction. She decided to live all that was still required on her path before thinking about becoming the wife of the missionary Ophlalas. Our paths were beginning to follow their own paths, and it was no longer possible to stay together. But it wasn't easy to accept this. It would take almost a year to achieve it. Americo Living Trail 240. Third. Back to the world. Introduction. When someone still has something to write for that very reason, it is no longer perfect, given that books are composed of words that will take on the meaning of one's own perception, the state of consciousness of each human being who reads them, and that, of course, is not perfect. The true sage lives in the eternal present, and for that very reason has nothing to write. It seems that the only thing that moves us to give a message is love for humanity. Each human being handles their concepts according to what they understand about them. For example, about la illuminación, each person, they think what they themselves consider true. Some even speak of enlightenment, based on the solar plexus and its proper function, or on the opening of the third eye, the Anat chakra. They even speak of enlightenment through Tantra Yoga, that is, sexuality whose fundamental center is the opening of the Svadhisthana or Muladhara chakra, at the base of the spine. And the truth is, we are all enlightened to a greater or lesser extent. From the moment we feel alive, we are all evidently enlightened. It's like talking about consciousness, and in itself, all human beings are conscious, even the unconscious. If we ask someone we consider unconscious, if they are conscious, they will almost certainly tell us yes, that they are perfectly conscious. But as we have said, there is awareness of unconsciousness without solution. That's why the living path is an intimate matter between us and the multidimensionality of life, us and our Father Mother, the Virgin Christ. When we speak of the truth, countless imitators appear. But also, as always happens with true scientists, there is hope that humanity will discover that the light lies within it. Let them judge only to judge themselves. Americo Living Trail 241 Enlightenment is impossible. But as Jesus Christ teaches, with God, nothing is impossible. This means that it is not we as the lower self who become enlightened, but rather God who becomes enlightened in us. The closest thing I know to this kind of transcendent immanent experience is that the world becomes a large chamber, where everything we think comes true. Like a magic chamber in an underground room, that is actually located inside a log-grand pyramid, the Pyramid of Cheops thought. It's said that when someone enters this underground chamber, everything they think becomes real. It's also said that some tourists have been gripped by terror and lost their lives. This is the reason why the underground chamber had to be closed. I would call this chamber, lighting chamber. So, even though we retain our physical body, we are no longer in the third dimension. Everything becomes completely mental. In reality, dark forces and demons exist, but it's our fears, anxieties, and lack of purity that attract them to our minds, and make us their prey. As students of the true path, we must know that at the threshold of multidimensionality, there is a moderator who protects us. And once we acquire it, La Illuminación, it becomes a real guardian. Only occultists know the details on this subject, but sometimes information is made available to the public. For example, there is an old 19th century book called Zanoni, that talks about this moderator referred to as the Watcher of the Threshold. He is a highly experienced angel who moderates everything that happens in the mind of the enlightened one, in order to try to protect him from his own madness or impurities. The Threshold Watcher inspires respect in everyone, even occultists speak of him with a certain awe, because if we are afraid, he appears to us as the devil, and if we overcome ourselves and love, he appears as a friend. The truth is, as humans, we are accustomed to associating a weak person with a good person. And someone who is truly good can seem bad to us. This angel does not have time to explain to us that he does everything, because it is good and sometimes it seems bad to us. The Threshold Watcher simply watches over, and ensures that outside forces do not harm us in our recent birth into a world that is completely unknown to us. Generally, all the unhealthy habits of childhood are removed from our minds, and we become one with the earth and the sky, which we begin to recognize as living beings. This is what will mark us, so that we can never again be the same, that is, unconscious beings. Americo Living Trail 242 All our ideas can backfire, if we fail to control our minds, and become eminently positive. If we've studied about many dimensions, parallel worlds, the dead, the devil, lust, evil, the powers of God in an unbalanced way, those ideas still become real. All of this was not crystal clear, and I had to figure it out, slowly but surely. Renaissance. I abruptly left my retreat between February 21st and 22nd, just as I entered the sign of Pisces. The morning after the first night I spent at my house in Netzahualcoyotl, I learned that a neighbor who lived very close by had been buried 2 days earlier. But the matter didn't end there. During the course of that week, the relative of my brother-in-law passed away, and the family got ready to attend 2 more wakes. I wasn't willing to stay away, because I needed to be close to them, and everything that happened to them filled me with interest after so many months without dealing with them directly. I attended these wakes, and while doing so, I began to understand that something in me had died. So as the people gathered around the rosaries said their prayers, it was as if they were also praying for me. Especially because these prayers were giving me a very special strength. My father had removed his business from the workers' colony, and survived as best he could, doing freelance work. This grandfather was like a father to my children, but he was sick, as always. However, this time there was an admirable difference, because while he was a regular meat eater, for some time now he had been trying to follow a vegetarian diet, as meat was very harmful to him. My cousin, the one who saw me, when I emerged from my retreat, wanted to help, but insisted that something bad was happening to me, and that it had to do with witchcraft or something like that. So she recommended that my mother take me to a witch doctor who lived toward the east of the city. And so, in early March of that year, I was still feeling very weak, and was undergoing certain therapies, such as cleansing with herbs, and other such things, which I accepted, since my family offered me the best they had. They even took me to the Catholic Church, so the priest could bless me with holy water. It was around this time that almost all of my little nephews and nieces gathered at our house. There were about 20 children, and for me, it was like something out of a storybook, but very comforting, to find myself among their cries and laughter. It was also strange. As if I had been reborn, or plunged back into a world that could no longer be the same as when I left it. Definitely returning to the world, although what divinity had in store for me remained a mystery. Americo Living Trail 243. I tried to locate my retreat partner, but she avoided me as much as possible. Her human side was taking control of her life, and her face no longer shone with its full essence, except only occasionally, and she would say to me, "I want to have a simple, human life again." I couldn't forget her, and neither could she forget me. However, she didn't understand why our relationship wasn't the same anymore. As soon as I left my retreat, and returned to my home in Netzahualcoyotl, I had to take care of the children, but my physical and mental health wasn't optimal, so my movements were slow. I decided to return to give lectures in the northern region, Ecatepec, Villa de las Flores. Here I was lovingly received by the sister who had previously extended her hand to allow me to teach astrology there. I immediately began to form a group, then start another one in Cuautitlán near Satellite City, passing Arbolledas. However, the money was very insufficient, because these people saw me simply as an astrology teacher, but not as an initiate and even less as someone who had come from a retreat. I spoke privately about my retreat with this sister, who was the owner of the Villa Center, and another Jagnian sister, pre-sympathizer, who had known me for years, considering that both belonged to the GFU, and showed me special esteem. I told them what I had experienced La Iluminación after a 40-month retreat. They half believed me, but they liked it, and supported me emotionally during this difficult journey, as best they could. Shortly after, I was invited to the Cuautla ashram of the University of La Chief Buenos Aires, and I accepted. They paid for my one-way ticket, and it was important for me to see how things were at the GFU. They took me directly to the sanctuary, and there, among the most frequent attendees of the initiatory school, I found my old love again. The sister who had returned from the East, and who, when we were most in love, had decided to break off our relationship. Here she was again, always with her flirtatiousness and feminine whims, pursued by her partner who seemed very much in love with her, but above all captivated by the sexual magnetism she inspired in him. A little girl about 4 years old was jumping around here and there, and I realized it was her little girl. Out of respect, I was dressed in light-colored clothing that day, and as soon as she recognized me, her face flushed with emotion, which she was a master at hiding. Americo Living Trail 244. After 2 hours of fraternal fellowship playing unusual youth games suggested by the coordinators, a brother from the group showed up largera quiato give la ceremonia cosmocad name Antonage. Even then, I was willing to go back to her, if my former lover had had the extraordinary reaction to leave her partner. I considered accepting her even with her only daughter, or with any 2 or 3 children she might have. The difference is that now I belonged to myself, and my emotions were not the foundation of my relationship. When the Antonage ended, as is customary, we sat on the carpet, to listen to the hierarch and the comments of those present. At one point, she asked to speak, and said with emotion, "Everything here has become routine. But this particular day is very different. It's clear that this time there are masters, in the invisible, here with us." After finishing her statement, she found a way to slip away towards the entrance of the compound, and I never saw her again. When I made my way to the exit of the ashram, immediately after that conversation ended, I said goodbye to my sisters from Villa de las Flores, and returned to Mexico City. These sisters' wish was for me to return to the Jagnian school at the GFU, but I was not in optimal condition to do so, and how could I return to a routine that was too slow in relation to everything I had experienced along the way? I didn't have enough money, because my students' fees were too low, and I couldn't ask for more. People had their own lives, so, for example, when the holidays or the end of the year came around, no one thought about whether the instructor needed a little more money. I wouldn't do that with an instructor who gave me classes in astrology, cooking, or anything else. In reality, as people, we live relatively conscious lives. So, back home in Netzahualcoyotl, I gathered some scrap iron my father had accumulated from his old workshop, and started selling it to places where they buy scrap iron. This is how, for a while, I made a little extra money. Sometimes I would return from giving my talks almost at midnight, because I had to go to Villa de las Flores or even Cuautitlán Cali. Fortunately, more than 2 months after I left my retreat, one of my brothers offered me a job as his employee, installing blinds in private homes. This was incredible, not because of the salary, which was quite modest, but because of the life experience it was giving me. After being so far away from people, I suddenly found myself entering the homes of all kinds of people. From very humble people to quite Americo living trail 245 wealthy ones. I entered more than 300 homes in a period of 2 months, and was able to see how people lived. Surely for my brother this was not a marvel, but for a man who has experienced firsthand what a retreat is like, everything becomes astonishing when he sees people from the privacy of their homes. It was as if I had become an inspector, directly assessing the state of humanity, examining how they experience their particular lives, behind the door that faces the street. For example, some people were lower middle class or well-to-do, and invited us to sit at their table to eat. Others were so wary, that they worried that we wouldn't step on their carpet with our shoes. Furthermore, my state of mind was very delicate, so I had to secretly bathe in one of the houses, so I could endure the entire day. In this regard, my brother was very understanding, and made sure the owners didn't suspect that we had not only gone into their bathroom to wash our hands, but also to soak my entire body. Fortunately, none of the guests noticed. While I was experiencing all this, I resisted losing my astrology group, which I had established since the days of Shayamitchan, before my retreat. So I gathered all their addresses, and began calling them. I asked one of them, who had followed me with great interest, to speak to all the others, and so I managed to gather them, giving them an appointment for a specific day. But they were no longer ready for me. I had surpassed them by far. There was only one smiling face from the one, who would become a cornerstone of my nascent group. He was a young, enthusiastic engineer by profession, with whom I was able to discuss many of the things I had experienced as an initiate. He was also able to explain how La Iluminación para mi friend had managed to do so. He was still trapped in his work life, as he worked as an engineer. One day, he told me he was going to Canada, and invited me to join him. But I knew that wasn't the way I wanted to go next. The children were young and needed me. I was trying to recover and get my mind under control. So, it wasn't the right thing for me. While he was planning his trip, I decided to return with Shayamitchan. I entered the Oro Center, and began flirting with the young secretary I'd just met. I told her about her beautiful eyes, and started joking around. I finally convinced her that Shaya really liked me, and had known him for a while. To give my words strength, I went up to the penthouse, at the top of the building, where Shaya lived. I greeted him, and he acknowledged me without enthusiasm. Luckily, I went down to the offices to give some instructions, and in front of the secretary, I told him we had already agreed to announce a talk on the radio. I accepted. And from one day to the next, I was invited back to the radio to announce my school. But this time I no longer had Shayamitchan's support. She simply ignored me. I meant nothing to her work, so the profits were minimal. Americo Living Trail 246. However, I met and formed a few small groups at Shayamitchan centers, and some women wanted to be with me, but I wasn't in the best mood. I really wasn't interested in other women. I had experienced their depths, and all these women who wanted to have sex with me simply weren't for me. Some actually fell in love, but there was simply nothing I could do. I clearly remember one afternoon, one of them waited for me, and we walked down Insurgents toward the metro station. Once we were there, I rejected her offer to sleep with her. At that moment, a thunderous voice in my head said, "With this act you are gaining eternity." It was a voice that practically thundered in my head, so much so, that I recognized it was coming from my Heavenly Father. It's not easy to explain, but it reminded me a lot of the part of the Gospel where John the Baptist was baptizing Jesus Christ and the voice was heard from heaven. "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." But I didn't give up, even though I had to meditate at least 4 hours a day, to be able to survive internally. For me, the formation of a strong group became an urgent need, and for this reason, I began to jot down in my address book all those places that seemed to be dedicated to psychology, metaphysics, occultism, etc. I visited several places, even going to provincial places like Toluca. I once called a psychology office and the person who answered was a woman who, as soon as she found out I wanted to teach psychoastrology, immediately hung up on me. I tracked down some old clients of my father's, and with the help of my brother, we installed some air conditioning. But money was tight. I needed more than a minimum of stability. Something compelled me not to let myself fall. An inner strength was with me despite the adversity and the enormous pain I felt due to the unacceptable distance from my partner. One afternoon, through an old friend from my former Shayamitchan group, I received an address for someone dedicated to metaphysics. Her name was Aurora, a rather significant name for the Aurora of a group following the guidelines of what she called the living path. She treated me very kindly, and one day, when I called her, she said, "I'm so glad you're calling, because I want to meet you. You made my birth chart many years ago, and I listen to that recording at least every 2 months, and that's what gives me the courage to move forward with my life." We arranged a date, and when she met me in person, she was surprised, because she thought he looked more mature than me. But she still invited 4 people to my brother's house, who still lived near Los Alamos Park, so we didn't meet up. Americo Living Trail 247. So I worked occasionally with Shayamitchan, and also with the small group of 4 people. Then one day, Aurora's classmate, named Angel, arrived and became my enthusiastic follower. I also told him that I had experienced this La Illuminación and that he was trying to help me, and thus help himself. He immediately took over as my disciple. He offered me private instruction, and so I decided to train him. He would arrive at his small business in the Guerrero neighborhood, and we would move some machines aside. Then, his 2 or 3 workers would do a yoga session, before they started work right there, as it was a small brush factory. In the courtyard of this old house, we would take bucketfuls of baths. It took more than a year of arduous work, and what he paid me was useful, but it was very little for the service I was providing. However, when he learned that I had a book to publish, and was already preparing it, he offered me 10,000 pesos he had collected from his work as a metaphysics instructor at the main center in La Hermandad Saint Germain. I asked him why he was lending me that money for my book, and he told me he was already planning to donate it for a project like mine. "When I ask you what kind of book you'd like to publish, I'll leave that up to you." Since I left my retreat, I had scribbled some notes. It was the book in which I described the names of Master Estrada and Master de la Ferrier. I was writing and copywriting other books that were important to me. By the way I found the copyright office was very peculiar. It all started when I somehow knew it was near Chapultepec. I don't know how, but guided by a hunch, I walked for about 2 hours and found it. Something internal definitely helped me find it, all in an abstract way. I took my retreat partner's old computer from my old apartment in the industrial neighborhood to my house in Netzahualcoyotl. I sold it halfway to my sister, so I could pay the final rent for the apartment where I finished my retreat. On it, I began storing the drafts of books I wanted to publish, and had written during that time. The first draft of The Path of Roses Without Thorns was a titanic task. I sought the support of a fellow student at La Gifta University of Mexico who worked at a well-known newspaper in Mexico, but I found that in some quarters within the GFU it was already known that I had ended my Aquarius marriage. He therefore no longer wished to be my student, given that I had sinned, leaving an Aquarian woman for a stranger who was my downfall. Furthermore, he was extremely upset by my appearance, as he already had a small astrology group at the Oro Institute, using knowledge I had imparted to him, when I was the director of Law School Astrology and Naturism. I offered to unify our efforts at the Oro Institute and he flatly refused. Americo Living Trail 248. Now all I had left was the desire to publish a book. Some student in my own class at the now squalid Oro High School That friend seemed capable of taking on the expense, but ultimately, the plan fell through. These young people definitely didn't have the courage. And when the opportunity presented itself to me by Aurora's companion, Anshul, I decided that the most worthy thing to do was not publish The Path of Roses, but a book about the lives of the masters. I titled it, Christian Line, The Gospel of the New Age. It was a book definitely ahead of its time, even for those at the GFU. When I was reviewing the draft on my old computer, a sign appeared that said, "Let's work together for Venezuela." He would run away and then reappear, indefinitely. This surprised me a lot, because in the book I wrote about Venezuela as La Nueva Jerusalem. So the incident wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was just garbage the computer had in its data, but in this case, it was just too much of a coincidence. I still saw my retreat partner sporadically, because there were unfinished business, like what to do with the things that made up our home in the last apartment. She really wanted to forget about everything, and to ensure perfect energy management, I decided it was best to leave all the material things to her. I mean the usual household items like the refrigerator, washing machine, etc. Then I realized I had to put my books down too. Furthermore, I didn't want my personal notes about 8 professional-grade notebooks, where I had handwritten all the messages from the channelings we had with the masters to go to waste. She didn't appreciate them, and I didn't want them, if she wasn't with me. So one day, I arrived at the apartment, and without her being present, I began tearing up page by page all the notes I had made throughout my retreat. I was doing this painful task, when she came in, and was amazed to see that pile of papers that were now worthless. It hurt me as much, as if I had seen the Library of Alexandria burn. I definitely wasn't willing to leave such precious messages with someone who now desired a simply human life. And it was also an act of renouncing what was most beloved, something that could only remain within us. It was really a hunch that this should remain only in my memory, without any extreme details of how the master of Lothair, Estrada, the Tibetan and others truly thought. This intuition gave me pause. These were the last visits to this department, and everyone was already going home. I took with me my personal notes, the master's psychological purposes, and a huge, handmade copper medallion, the same as his chain. It was the symbol of the commander of all. A medallion that only the enlightened one she had recognized as her master, before meeting me, had in that size. In reality, as I wrote above, she had introduced that medallion, Americo Living Trail 249 into my belongings without my realizing it, as a token of her love, which in this way, sought to ensure that I continued to be protected on my spiritual path. I also had writings and diagrams about Camino de Rosas, and what would become the book on quantum physics that I would title, Gravitación Cosmos. I tore up many of the notes and only presented the summary as a book, so I could copyright it in Mexico. I didn't want people to think I was crazy when they found out what I thought about life and quantum physics on a very personal level. So I calculated what people could accept as real without feeling attacked. My mother had some of my personal notes, which she returned to me. And a short piece that was part of a fictional essay. I threw it away, even though I could have easily published it. But I was trying to survive, and this no longer fit with my current transcendental experiences. Some nights, immediately after my return to Netzahualcoyotl's house, I would apply acupuncture, based on what I learned from my retreat partner, and I would also go under a pyramid, placed over my bed, while sleeping. I made a pyramid with a copper top, extended by rods to the floor, and gave it to Shea, so she could meditate, while going under it. But she didn't attach much importance to what, to me, seemed a very valuable gift. A few months later, my father fell ill again, and had to be hospitalized as an emergency. He was in agony. The doctors were able to monitor him for about a month, and during that time, I decided to visit our Avenue Phoenix Center in Arbolitos, Valderrado. Something hadn't completely settled, and I wanted to get this over with. I felt entitled, but at the same time, I wanted to make sure she really wasn't the one for me. So I arrived one afternoon, but no one was there. I returned the next day, and there was my roommate, who had already been sleeping here for a while. She was terrified when she saw me. The last thing she wanted was for me to show up here. Something strange was happening to her, a strange power had taken hold of her. She greeted me normally, but nervously, and said, "I knew that something delicate was going to happen this day, because I just looked at the anniversaries, and saw that Lunate is in Scorpio. The moon has its fall in Scorpio." This made me think of women and the Greek myth about Orpheus, the music lover who finally, when women realized that he could not be any of them in particular, because they all loved him madly, then, mythology tells us that his body was brutally dismembered by all of them, so that each of them could have at least a part of him. Scorpion symbolizes this unhealthy obsession, when it fails to be reborn as a phoenix, and if Lunate is found here, it is said, it is falling, being that this represents women. She made sure I went up to one of the Institute's offices, as if to give me time. Meanwhile, I looked around the place, the good computer they'd bought, the rooms, the office furniture, and everything with great interest and a certain nostalgia. We were in a situation when my classmates' aunts and the man who had tried to be my student arrived. I went downstairs behind her to greet them, and seeing the student and Americo Living Trail 250, my classmate together, I realized for the first time that she had chosen him, especially since he was ready to defend her. I tried to approach her, but everyone protected her, and my former student, eager to prevent me from approaching him, lunged at me, squeezing my neck with both hands, not exactly trying to strangle me, but trying to apply firm pressure to a certain spot in that area. Finally, he pressed a particular spot, and made me faint. It was the first and only time I truly lost consciousness. As I fell, my head hit the ground hard, and began to bleed. But when I lost consciousness, the most wonderful thing I've ever experienced happened. I entered a higher plane, and was cared for by beings of light. I don't remember the details, but they definitely filled me with so much light, that when I came to, I was radiant with happiness, filled with forgiveness and love. I immediately experienced that all the bonds the masters had established between my retreat partner and me in their eagerness to service were broken in a single instant. In addition, I was filled with their infinite love. That's why when I came to, I felt liberated and happy. When I regained consciousness, my former student stood guard in case I felt inclined to insist, while my companion was already sheltered by her women, far from the scene. That was the last time I saw her. I woke up still in this ecstasy, the light still dancing in my being. I asked him for a cloth soaked in water to stop the bleeding, so I could leave and never return. I was filled with a placidity that I cannot explain. It was truly like entering into inner planes, and being able to feel its flavor and presence for the rest of my life. It is the full and real experience of being in a perfect and sublime world. I walked down the street, and called my retreat partner's mother on the first phone I found, and thanked her for everything. I told her that I now understood that she, her daughter, wanted to continue her human life and probably have another partner. But I was doing well, and that she, her mother, was giving her my books as a thank you for everything. She accepted them with great joy. As always, a fine woman. From there I went straight to the hospital to visit my father. A few days later, my father regained consciousness, and as soon as he woke up, he started kissing us all. The doctor said there was no cure. But my father didn't want to die in the hospital, but at home. That's why they discharged him. I remember my father sitting on the living room couch, and I often accompanied him. Inside, I was having a fierce struggle. The telepathy was active, but I couldn't control it. Entities would speak to me, telling me they were coming to take care of me, but others would immediately attack, causing me to gasp for air at times. But in the midst of this, my father enjoyed being here with me, while we both tried to watch television and relax. It was one of these days that he asked me a question he'd never asked before. He said, "What happens when you die? Where do you go?" Americo Living Trail 251. I sensed he was somewhat afraid. So I began to tell him that death didn't exist, that one arrived at a place where they took care of us, that it was a very pleasant place. And things like that. My father was cared for by my mother, and the two returned to their newlywed state of love. I could tell by the way they treated each other and kissed. They did so with great mutual understanding. At night, the psychic attacks worsened for me. My father was in the next bed, and my mother was watching over him. I think it gave him confidence knowing I was close by. Later, my father no longer had the strength to bathe. And my sisters were afraid to force him. But then I would come home from some business outside and scold them. Then I would grab my father and scold him as well. Meanwhile, he watched me, frightened, in his already semi-conscious state. I would undress him, screaming and everything, and make him walk, leading him to the bathroom, to run water over him, bathing him. Then I would dress him, and let him rest. About 10 days passed like this, until one morning, he finally passed away. At that moment, my mother called me. She was more or less calm. I touched my father's feet, and then his head, and lovingly said, "Don't be afraid, old man. Rest now." My mother admired my calm in moments like these. Like years ago, one day when my father was riding in the back of the vehicle, spitting blood into a bucket. Meanwhile, I was driving the old jalopy to the hospital. But one of those times, at a given moment, my father seemed to be dead, and my sister despaired. A minute or so passed, and they were agonizing. I parked the truck in front of the emergency room entrance at Mexico City General Hospital, and went to my dad. At that moment, I used my willpower powerfully, calling him firmly, and shaking him several times, until he came around again. I don't know if it was with my inner strength that brought him back from the dead, or if he was just unconscious. But it was miraculous. And my mother and sister looked at me in amazement. Anyway, as soon as my father died, I immediately went there with my children, who were sleeping in the modest room next door, and spoke to them, still young. The oldest was perhaps 12. I told them that Grandpa had gone to a better place. They knew nothing about what I meant. But since my mother and I had instilled in them that death doesn't really exist, but is rather a change of plane of existence, the little ones took it all very calmly. Sometime later, the Virgin Mary telepathically congratulated me for the fortitude I had at the time of my father's death, while I was struggling with negative forces within myself. She told me it was very difficult for a man to remain well and balanced in such moments. The truth is that, during that period, from the time I left my retreat until my father's death, I forgot about old arguments stemming from his selfishness and possessiveness over his little workshop and the like. In fact, I remained positive and strong-willed, so we both said goodbye without holding any grudges. And then I realized that this event symbolized, in a very real way, my own rebirth. For the sun represents our father in astrology. And because of everything I had recently experienced, I was being reborn. Americo Living Trail 252. The following month, I had a very high fever, and my heart was very stressed, but amidst this delirium, a man dressed entirely in white, with a sublime vibration, appeared in my mental field very clearly. I understood that he was an ascended master of wisdom, and he said to me, "Let me help." I didn't respond with words, but with the veneration that this being awakened in me in that moment, when I was able to see him so clearly, that I would never forget him. He was an ascended master who had taken on a miniature size, and entered my heart. Once there, he moved something, as if making some urgent, special adjustments, and then left. Then I felt a great relief in my heart, as if all the energy I insisted on bringing to the crown of my head suddenly found stability right in my heart. I wanted to know why I was a person who was experiencing all these things, and I thought there must be someone who had achieved enlightenment. One afternoon, I was returning from teaching at a Shea center located next to Plaza Satellite, and I let my guard down inside, which was harnessed by undesirable energies that began to hit where it hurt the most. I went to my mother, so she could hug me. She became so concerned that she made an appointment with a special doctor who worked with a prestigious astrologer who offered his services on the way to Chapultepec, visiting another illuminated one. That night I said to myself, "Father, by your infinite goodness, if there is another person who has experienced it, La Iluminación, allow me to know him or her, so that I can understand what is happening to me." The next day, my mother and two of my brothers took me to this holistic healing center. I was greeted by the doctor's secretary. Once in his office, I found him to be a very kind man, about 5 years older than me. He had me sit in a chair about 2 meters away from him, and I realized it was a precaution. Surely some of his strange patients went crazy, and if that happened, it would give the doctor himself time to react, so he could protect himself. He immediately asked me what was wrong. I said, "My 7th chakra has opened, I have gone through la iluminación." The doctor who was listening to me did not flinch, but asked me several questions about it and then added, "My 7th chakra has also opened." I'm an enlightened one. But this cannot be spoken of, brother. No one can understand it, except those who have experienced it. I understand that sexuality elevating energy is what has helped you achieve it. Also like you, Americo Living Trail 253. I practiced a lot of yoga, and belonged to the GFU. I lived for a long time with a woman who allowed me to elevate my energy. And you know, of thousands who seek the path through yoga, rituals, and things like this, only one reaches at point la iluminación. I listened to him with admiration. He told me he would be able to see me at his office for future appointments. But that closing the seventh chakra again, as I had suggested, was impossible. He would only help me, and that I should truly trust in God. When I left there, I realized that telepathy and other abilities were going to become inherent within me, and that if I handled any of it negatively, it would create inappropriate reverberations within my mind, attracting negative entities that would begin to bother me. But if I did it right, at least I'd be at peace. I thanked God for allowing me to meet someone who had experienced this special process, and then I truly began the process of mastering such a state. It took me a little over a year to achieve the basics, to be able to live better, but this was just the beginning. Only then did I begin to meditate, or as the master of meditation would say la rear, to move from la meditación meditation to concentration. I understood what the wise potentially meant when he spoke of moving from meditation to concentration. I called it contact with God. First contacts. As I said, I used acupuncture to try to balance myself. All those nights, I used to put acupuncture needles in certain points on my body, trying to remember how my partner did it. Then I realized that I could actually distinguish, guided by my intuition, where the point was where I should put the needle. I was once praying to the woman I knew as Kuan Yin, the goddess of mercy. My way of asking her was, "Beloved old woman, fill me with your love." And soon she appeared in my mental field, enveloped in her violet radiance. She was a young girl of barely 18, but divinely attractive. I immediately fell in love with her, and she said to me with indescribable tenderness, "Not even that old, brother." I felt their radiation so strong and real, that I knew that beings of light truly existed. But I had already suffered enough to no longer trust all the messages bouncing around in my mind. However, I still kept turning to the light. So I didn't know how to behave. It was then that I heard a voice that was clear for the first time, and it said to me, "Americo Living Trail 254. Thank you for your service." I wanted to defend myself and block the message, but then he added, "I'm Lady Rowena." It was a tender voice. The following week, watching television, they were showing the story of who had been Queen Lady Rowena, defending the helpless from injustice. Later I visited a stationery store near my house, and was served by a young lady whom I really liked. Her name was America. I liked her, and she made an effort to fulfill my requests, to make good photocopies for my brochures that I sold to my students. Since I didn't know how not to fall in love with her, the one who called herself Lady Rowena spoke to me. "Love her with all your strength and your heart, and follow your path." I realized that loving is how we free ourselves. It's not fighting, but letting what must be, without accepting anything less than just this. In other words, without allowing interference from our lower self. So I wrapped her in pink light, and every time I saw her, I blessed her with this attitude. Little by little, I had to accept that this person wasn't for me. Especially because she was a delicate young woman affected by asthma, as I discovered by chance. This was the main reason why all her siblings and family at the stationery store cared for her with such affection. Another day, I was sitting in one of the seats of a bus called a minibus, trying to intuit that, if I could recognize priestesses and gurus among the people, then, simply by the fact that they were able to see me, and love what I could teach them, perhaps they would have a chance. And if this could happen in every institution of wisdom, quite possibly this openness would free us from many of life's dogmas. People were getting on and off, paying their fares. These thoughts were swirling around in my head when suddenly, upon closing my eyes, I saw myself in what is called the fifth dimension. Our Christ self. I've learned that we all have a Christ Virgin, Christ Goddess, within us. It's our fifth dimension. We are ourselves as an essence. At this particular moment, I contemplated myself for the second time in my inner Christ. I saw myself with long, swept-back hair and dressed in white, with a look of great peace. And before me were the 5 or 6 women who were attending my classes at the home of the sister who had lent us her space for the session. Americo Living Trail 255. They bowed their heads with great devotion and respect, and I touched each one of them with my hand, saying, "I'm not going to throw my wisdom away to someone who isn't interested, so out of the love you feel for the master, I'm going to give it to you, because you are worthy." I don't know how long the experience lasted. I estimate about half a minute, although it seemed like 10 minutes, and when I opened my eyes I was simply in the public transport van. I thought about the matter, and indeed, I was recruiting people who were capable of listening to me with genuine interest, and I was willing to allow this pilot group to carry out my work and pass on my knowledge. It didn't matter if they weren't vegetarians, didn't practice yoga, didn't meditate, etc. What interested me was that they were there, eager to learn, and better than any fanatical scientist, they opened their hearts, even a little, and leaned into their intuition and their need to improve. That was it. They were there, and I was here, eager to give to them. These were the kinds of groups of a great universal fraternity that I was interested in founding. Another day, I was sitting comfortably in a foreign truck taking me to Villa de las Flores, and when I closed my eyes, I saw a half-naked man wearing a helmet with holes for his horns to protrude, and a beautiful gemstone protruding from his navel. He was a kind of Viking, and he greeted me. I was very surprised why he had appeared just like that in my mental field. I tried not to see him, as if to say in broad daylight, because sometimes the image became blurry. He said to me, "What are you surprised about, brother? On the plane where I find myself, there are many beings of many forms and types who do a lot to help humanity." I remembered that in my house in Netzahualcoyotl there was a plastic bone figure that had exactly that Viking shape. I must have been staring at it recently, without realizing that such a being existed on the inner plane. "I've been with you these past few days to help you fight, because I'm a warrior," I affirm, continuing, "but now I find you stronger, and my mission with you is over. I appear before you to bid you farewell. Goodbye." That was all he said to me as the light in my mental field faded, as did his voice. On another day, I was finishing my yoga session at the house in Netzahualcoyotl, praying with great devotion to the forces of light to grant me peace. And once again, my mental field opened, but this time fully, like the first vision of Master Estrada. And a beautiful woman, like a goddess clothed in the face of a peasant, appeared and smiled at me. I knew without words that it was Amun Caridad. She wasn't looking at me, but inside herself. And she radiated a beautiful pink all over her. One never tires of contemplating her. I was overcome with her presence, peace, and eternal love. Americo Living Trail 256. He remained before me for about 10 seconds, which seemed like years to me. Then he vanished as a voice said to me, "It is your privilege to be able to contemplate this exalted being." That voice told me this in such a way, as if it also established a pact with this divine entity. And indeed, every time I feel like I'm going to falter, I remember this beautiful presence, and the desire to contemplate such beauty again drives me forward again. A short time later, while I was asleep, I was awakened on the higher plane, that is, conscious of being outside my body. Guided by some invisible force, I was transported to where the master was, la real in concrete, but not on the physical plane. This is the first time I remember having contact with him in this direct way. The master wasn't being followed by large crowds, but by a group of foreigners from various parts of the world. A group of no more than 40 people. It was incredible that so few people had access to the master of La Ferrier. And among them, I don't remember seeing anyone from the GFU. A foreigner approached me, and as I was ecstatic watching how the master, by moving his hands, and doing mental concentrations, made light of many colors come out of his body, she told me, "This master's love and power are incredible. Don't you think?" I believed it, and I let him know. But I realized that everyone kept a considerable distance so as not to get too close to the master. They respected him, and had a very special devotion to him. They simply accepted his teachings, and that's how they remained. The scene changed, and now the people were inside a fairly large room, sitting on the floor, while the master gave them a talk. I arrived at this place, and at the entrance of the building, some people were preparing food for when people left or passed by. I asked them for the master of the temple, La Ferrier, and they told me he was giving a talk, so I went up. When I saw the master, I didn't sit far away, but went straight up to him and greeted him. He looked at me and returned the greeting, beginning to chat, as if we were great friends. The conference ended, and we both continued to exchange comments. Then he started laughing, and said to me, "I've also been to places where astrologers are, and in one of them I've tried polk." I realized he was joking. Americo Living Trail 257. Then the scene changed, and there was next to me a brother of a hierarchy a little lower than mine. Next to the master La Ferrier there was already a being of light of a higher hierarchy than the master, who first blessed the person who was next to him, and then turned to me, to give me a blessing and to recognize my higher hierarchy. His energy was so great, that I felt a little afraid of having him so close, so that suddenly I perceived him, as if he were a high-ranking military officer, giving me orders in his own style. And this great master, who didn't allow me to know who he was, said to me very clearly, "You are hereby appointed to the 33rd grade, Inspector General of Law Grand Fraternity Universal." I returned to my conscious physical state, and as I did so, the master La Ferrier accompanied me. Upon awakening, I could still hear his voice. It must have been, so that I wouldn't forget the appointment I had been given. When he became certain of this, I stopped hearing him. My small groups began to grow stronger, and since my teachings could no longer be limited to those of an astrology professor, I decided that these 3 or 4 groups I had in different institutes and locations should become a pilot group. That's when one of these sisters offered me an apartment she wasn't occupying, so I could meet them every Saturday. I had no preconceived idea of forming a particular movement, and yet it had to be that way. Maestro Marcelli's farewell. I thought that to publish my books and to do my work with La GFU, whom I've always had in mind, I should seek out my teacher Marcelli, and so I did. I called him on the phone, and after talking with him for a while, he recognized who I was. He then made an appointment for me at his office in Eugenia. During this time, I had a dream in which Master Marcelli sent me to help some yoga institutes prosper in the state of Puebla, Mexico. When I woke up, I felt that this wasn't what I expected from him. Nor did it fit with what I was experiencing. The day of the appointment arrived, and I showed up on time. He greeted me very kindly, but both he and I had changed. I noticed him looking older, perhaps more disillusioned with what the GFU Brotherhood can do, and not always for the better. I confessed to him that, after leaving my children, and ending my relationship with their mother, I had fallen in love with a woman, and went to live with her in a sort of retreat. Americo Living Trail 258. And that after a few years, something incredible happened. I tried to explain it to him like this: "Master, you won't believe this, but my crown chakra has opened." Indeed, I couldn't believe it. Perhaps because for that, he must have experienced it himself. It is naturally inconceivable that a disciple far from La GFU, doing wrong things with his own family, and living with a woman who is not from La GFU, achievas la iluminación. And from this arise all the mitigating factors, such as, for example, not being a guru, breaking the rules of La Sagrada Tradición initiation, and in this sense, instead of remaining celibate for several years, to reach higher states of consciousness, it is precisely through having sex that they are achieved. The master must have considered me a dreamer who was perhaps trying to deceive him. How many people must come to the master with inventions like this, in order to make a career within the GFU? The master tried to remain friendly as I finished speaking. But as I did, I realized I was losing him. I then told him I needed to publish some books and perhaps he could support me. Naturally, without ceasing to be polite, he categorically refused, in the most subtle way permitted by his Sat Arhat status. He had many matters to attend to as general manager of La GFU Lini Solar. I left the place, and had to admit that my former master's incomprehension hurt me deeply. As I headed toward the stairs at World Headquarters, I turned back to give him my address, in case he felt like talking to me. I arrived at his office, and a woman was walking by, claiming to be a yoga practitioner.